Hello, everyone. Um, this is going to be a longer video. This is a tutorial, and this is it's going to be talking about the patterns that I see repeated again and again in bold action. And I've made a long PowerPoint explaining that. So this is basically like me trying to teach you guys something about what it is that I see, and maybe trying to get a common vocabulary about that. So let's go and watch, and I'll talk you through it. Right. So this is about army builds in bold action, and when I came back from the last WTC, I had a lot of talks with Russell. I made videos about that, and you can go and watch those. And Russell was crunching the numbers for what had happened. And one of the things that sort of came up in that work, in me communicating with Russell and him doing that, it was that we started finding out we needed some sort of common vocabulary for talking about army lists, and it isn't there right now. And then I started thinking about well, we talk a lot about meta and what is good in bold action, what is not, right? What units that are good. But what if we could talk about what army lists that are good, what sort of types of builds that could be good? And that is the pattern that I see repeated. There are certain ways in which people construct their lists, certain patterns that they repeat, sort of so that some lists become similar. And of course, this is especially true if you're running certain nations. So Japanese lists will often resemble other Japanese lists. But you can see crossover between nations where they repeat a certain pattern. Um, and I find that for me, it's helpful to be aware of those patterns because it increases my likelihood of my understanding and a list when I see it, understanding an opponent's ideas behind his army, what it is that he wants to do. And it does help to establish that common vocabulary so that we know what we're talking about. Now, the disclaimer here is, of course, that any and all games have a have this. If you have list building as a part of the game, the rules themselves will encourage you to repeat these patterns, to have some patterns in what you that the rules will make you think is good and not good. And there are ways in which bold action does this quite clearly. Look at the generic reinforced force platoon selector and the theater selectors and the tank selectors. Look at those and see that there are things you have to do and things you can do. That combination, things you have to do and things you can do, they are the limitations and they are the possibilities. And those limitations and possibilities encourages certain behaviors. So that is what will create those army builds, that pattern of how these selectors have been set up and how the points value for each unit combines with the effectiveness of those units. So this is why I'm talking about army builds today, to talk about the patterns and to try and establish common words for these patterns. So the first platoon that I want to talk about is the historical platoon. The historical platoon is something that I see repeated from what us competitive players call the rivet counters. People who play the game because they enjoy World War II history. and they will typically try to recreate what a real infantry platoon would look like. So they'll have large units, quite often with equipment that may not in the game actually be good because it's not encouraged by the pattern. So LMGs, for instance, LMGs are too expensive per shot for what they deliver. But in historical platoons, you'll quite often see LMGs embedded in units. You'll have lieutenants with a few helpers, irrespective of whether they're good or not. You'll quite often see lieutenants of a higher level of experience. And you'll see team weapons. Some of the team weapons that will quite often not be good. So you'll see MMG teams, but you'll also see some that may be good, medium mortars or light mortars that could have been in a historic platoon. You'll see a medic, because many platoons, of course, had their own medics embedded in the units. Maybe some transport, but the rivet counters typically dislikes having transport on the battlefield itself because, of course, on almost all World War II battlefields of the scale that we are replaying in bolt action, you wouldn't see trucks, right? Because and even the Hanomaks, the armored carriers would most likely not be there. Because transport is vulnerable. It's a bullet magnet in real life. So you would not want your transport to go too near the enemy. The thing that is with historical platoons and why these will often lose games against other types of army builds is that they do not actually consider the game mechanics as being important. What they consider being important is whether or not you can recreate history, and that is not conforming to the pattern of the game, what the game will encourage you to do. So as a general rule, I expect historical platoons to lose games, and not necessarily though, because one of the things that Russell actually uncovered was that it is more important who the player is than what the list is. So these army builds I'm going through here they won't there is no auto win army build. There is the player's play style, what they like to play, and then there is the list. But lists can predict 60%-ish whether or not a game is won. It's 86%, by the way. You can predict from how good the player is with 86% accuracy. So, so the player is way more important than the list. Just in case anyone is complaining that I'm all about lists, it's just what's easy to talk about. Right. So, and historical platoons, they don't actually consider the lists. They don't consider the game mechanics, and that is why they will quite often lose at tournament play, and if you're running games where you are focused on having a winner and a loser. If you're just doing thematic events where you recreate like a specific battle, then go right ahead, because that is another type of fun. Then we have the mixed bag or the balanced platoon. I saw these quite a lot, and I still see them quite a lot, especially from beginning players. But there are competitive adherents to this philosophy as well. I think, for instance, Alistair of the Scottish national team is a proponent of these types of lists. So there are competitive players who likes this. It has a good mix of units, so it has at least 3 infantry units. It has some HE. It has some armor like tanks, and it has a full complement of teams, so that it has all the tools that it needs. It can deal with multiple missions, it can deal with multiple types of terrain, and it can deal with multiple types of enemy army builds. But it isn't particularly good at any one aspect of the game, right? It's you can get better infantry, you can get better HE, you can get better armor, and you can get better teams than this. This just has it all. In one specific aspect of the game, they will typically be overpowered by an army that has that one aspect as its main focus, if that army gets to do that. But in all the other aspects, it's on average better than what it is going to face. The risk for me, for what I see, and you guys may feel differently about it. This is just why I don't typically run mixed bag platoons. It is that it has the risk of quite often becoming reactive, where you are reacting to what the opponent wants to do, because the opponent has a clear plan with their army build often, which means that you're reacting to them. And as soon as you are reacting instead of enacting your plan, then there is a real possibility that initiative has shifted to the enemy. The enemy will dictate the battle and they will win. So it really is a good way to build platoons, but I see this more for reactive players, and they have a tendency maybe to lose to active players. So that is why I'm not necessarily a fan of this mixed bag platoon, balanced. Then we have the pseudo tank lists. For many theater lists, many theater selectors, and if you can run multiple platoons, you can build something that sort of end up resembling a tank selector. It's even possible to do this with a single generic reinforced platoon in some armies. The pseudo tank list has 4 or more armored vehicles, which means that you're spending much of your point allotment on your vehicles, on tanks and on armored transports. So this means that quite often the pseudo tank list is quite weak on infantry, because you don't have the points. It can be very, very mobile because everything is movable most of the time. And it really can do concentration of force, right? Where you throw most of your army against one flank of the enemy, push through that flank and just roll them off from the side. That is possible with a pseudo tank list because it's so maneuverable. But it is weak in certain missions, and it is also very weak. There are certain lists that are hard counters against pseudo tank lists that really that tank lists cannot deal with. So the pseudo tank list is a high risk, high reward type of army build, and it is a very active army build, whereas the mixed bag that we talked about just before is a reactive army build. This is a very active army build. With this army build, you want to move forward, you want to attack. This is maybe something that favors aggressive players more than non-aggressive players. So, and I have run these pseudo tank lists quite a few times. So they can be really good, but they can also lose big. Then I'm seeing quite a few gun lines, and maybe like the last 2 years, I've seen more of these army build. Now, gun lines is where you max out on your HE. So you'll typically have 3 or more HE deliverers, howitzers, mortars, possibly even a tank, because there are tanks in the tank slots that can have a howitzer mounted, so it's basically what we would call mobile artillery, right? The Horo springs to mind. That is bought in the tank slot selection. So, and there are certain army lists that are really good at this. So, for instance, Romanians, Bulgarians, French, Belgians, because they get free extra howitzers. All of that is really good if you want to run a gunline army. Typically, you'll also see that they have a good amount of infantry, these gunline armies. But of course, you can't spend too much points on the infantry. And most of the time, the infantry will be out in front of the gun lines themselves. So you're going to have to shoot in directly most of the time, unless you open up certain like lanes of fire where the howitzers can shoot down. It is very, very strong, this list. It is a very strong defensive list, although typically it has trouble dealing with offense. I'll get back to like one specific game where I had brought a very aggressive offensive list, and I actually got beaten by a gunline army. So it's very strong on defense, and it is good on open tables, and it is really good when you have a lot of opportunities to go on ambush. It can be weak if there's too much terrain, and it can also be weak against certain very hard counter lists. So lists that are really good in outflank, or where you can't really shoot at them for some reason. That can be really, really difficult. Now, I said before that reactive lists can struggle against active, aggressive lists. And that is true, but it can also be the other way around. I had a game about a year ago against a German player, Stefan. Hi, Stefan. And we were playing one of those missions that has one objective in the center of the table, and I was defending it. So I had placed some of my infantry around that, and the rest was just moving up. And I was running veteran infantry, and I was running basically a pseudo tank. It was a tank platoon. It was a true tank platoon. I had 3 stewards. And he had a gunline army. He had howitzers, he had mortars, and he had a lot of infantry. And he had some tanks, but they were pretty weak, not like very, very strong tanks. And he absolutely shot me to bits. So what can happen, even though you're going to have to, he had to move from table edge, so he had to go onto the table, then he had to weather the fire that I was pouring into him. He had to weather my, I was playing Brit, so I had a forward observer that went down onto him as well, and he still started shooting at me, and he absolutely obliterated me with HE. He hit with his mortars, he hit with his howitzers, and I got murdered. Now, what actually won him the game here was that he had accepted that he had to try and move, and he had accepted that he had a table where he had the opportunity to move and he had the opportunity to shoot at the same time. So he placed his guns at one point, he placed his infantry on the sides, his infantry moved forwards every single turn, while his guns were just pounding me every turn. And the table was open enough for him to actually win the game. So gunline armies can be active, but typically they're not. Right. Then we have the Noob Basher, which is the MRL spam, multi-rocket launcher spam. And I call this the Noob Basher because I've seen some competitive players in my club run this when they reach a certain level of competency. When they are at a certain level in their development as a competitive player, they suddenly start being very focused on running a lot of multi-rocket launchers. Matthias, I'm looking at you. And I think this is sort of a trap. Although I and have seen really strong competitive players bring these MRL spam lists to competitive events. We saw it at the Danish Nationals, where Paul Wickens had brought a multi-rocket launcher spam list. A lot of Katyushas, I think it was 5 or something, insane. And we also saw that at the first WTC in Poland, where we also saw multi-rocket launcher spam lists. I think it was with the Welsh team which had brought one? Can't remember. Anyways, so the multi-rocket launcher spam list, you would prefer to have at least 4 multi-rocket launchers in those lists, but 2 plus sort of smells a bit like a multi-rocket launcher spam, right? And the reason I say it's a Noob Basher is that it can be impossible to play against. It can really, because you're rolling so many dice, if your enemy doesn't know how to deal with this, then you're pounding him with rockets all of the time. And if he doesn't spread out, and if he doesn't hide well enough, any army will disintegrate against this, and you may end up feeling that you have no chance in this game. So a new player, a noob, will possibly struggle quite a lot against these lists. But there's also the risk that this will fail horribly. This is a high risk, high reward type of glass cannon, because it really depends on you rolling 6s. If you don't roll those 6s, you're not going to win. You're going to have a bad day, and your Katyushas are going to get shot and killed, and you can fail horribly with this list. So yeah, that's the Noob Basher list. I don't see that quite so often as I see gunline armies or solo tank armies, but it does crop up sometimes. Then we see the Horde armies. Horde armies crop up quite a lot, and very often in specific nations. Japanese. They are maxed out on infantry, so they will have full strength infantry units, and they'll typically have 60 plus infantrymen. Most often they'll be inexperienced because of the points. When you're buying that many infantry bodies, it becomes very expensive. But you can see some lists. I've seen lists with 120 infantrymen in the list. So you can really build large armies. And they can be very good because they're so difficult to chew through. You're going to have to kill so many men that it actually becomes difficult just to do that in the allotted time. In those 6 turns, you're going to have to kill 10 plus infantrymen per turn, just in order to like chew through his army. That is really difficult. So the first thing you're going to have to accept is you're not going to kill all his infantry. That typically won't happen against Horde armies. And if you are going to kill his infantry, you're going to need to do it in close combat, and that for most armies is not possible. These Horde armies, can be very aggressive, very assaulty, but the way that I see it played that is actually even better than being aggressive with a Horde is when you play it cleverly, when you you build up your attack slowly, making sure every turn that you move a bit forward, but that you string your army along cover so that it has hard or soft cover all the time, and it doesn't get shot to bits on the assault while you're like inching forwards. that those players who do that, and that maybe especially like players like Manuel or our own Benny, they're really good at using these large infantry units and every turn just moving a bit forward, going down if you need to, whatever. Not being overly aggressive with them. That is really strong. It is weak in kill point missions though, because typically when you have so many units, they are not very good and they're not very strong. So typically you will end up trading at least 1-to-1, maybe even 3-to-2, 2-to-1 with the enemy when you're playing hordes. Can be a lot of casualties. So they can be weak in those missions, but they can also, if you play them conservatively, be really strong. One thing you're going to have to take note of is when you have that many infantrymen, they are going to be up front of the rest of your army. Their support is going to be behind them, which means they are in the way. You can't shoot directly, so you're going to have to shoot indirectly if you have guns. And you're going to have to accept that most of the time the infantry is just going to get in your own way. But you can actually play to this as an advantage because your own units will give you cover, right? So if you layer your units in horde armies, they will give the units behind them cover, which is good, really good. Right, that was the horde army. Oh, and by the way, horde armies, we see them in tournaments. They crop up, but they're very difficult to play in the tournament because moving about 60 to 100 infantrymen each game, it gets tiring. So you'll quite often see horde army players actually having movement trays for their infantry because physically it is hard. Then we have the Death Star units. We typically see this from rookie players, from noobs, who are starting out and want to feel that tiger, want to feel that panther, that big tank, that KV2. So the Death Star is something that was a really good build back in the days when I was playing 40k. And the idea is that you build the hardest unit you can, a unit that is almost impossible to kill and that's really threatening, and that will just go up and stomp directly into the enemy, and the enemy will focus too much on pouring fire into that Death Star, on just maybe stopping it, maybe slowing it down a bit. And while he's doing that, the rest of your army wins the mission. That is how Death Star Army plays. It doesn't really work that well in bold action because those 200 points plus tanks in bold action can get stopped by a single Panzerfaust, or even worse, by a single Flamer. So this is not a competitive build that I've seen work competitively in bold action, although I really wanted to because I miss my Death Star. It typically has 1 or 2 200 point plus units. Quite often it's just one because the points just add up to those, and it's quite often a big tank. That tank is almost unkillable. It's a bullet magnet and it's almost unkillable. But then again, a single flamethrower can make it run away. And I've played against people playing like this Death Star builds, and I had one flamethrower, and I knew that all I wanted to do was give him enough pins so that the flamethrower, when I moved up and I flamed him, that he would fail his morale test, and it happened. And that sucks. When you poured 300 points into a tank, having it just die to a flamer, oh, that sucks. I can understand. I'm very sympathetic to my opponent in that game. I'm still terribly sorry about that. I wanted to win the tournament, so I had to win. But damn, that was just a rough game for him. So And what's especially damaging to this Death Star type is that the rest of the list becomes very, very weak. It can't really deal with what the enemy is pouring into it, and especially so because it will typically be low on order dice, and that means that you're handing the initiative over to the enemy. The enemy has more order dice. They can sort of dictate when and where they will attack and how, and you can't do a thing. You can put your Death Star in ambush, but that means you're not being aggressive with it. That sucks. So the game mechanics of bolt action doesn't encourage this build, but people will still do it. So yeah, doesn't work. Then we have Motorized Infantry. This is an interesting build, which I'm seeing more and more of. For me, we've been in a meta for a while where the most common build that I saw was lists that had a lot of flamers, which I'm going to get to in a moment. But now I'm seeing more and more of these motorized infantry lists, and for some nations they can be really strong. For some nations they're not that good, actually. This really depends on whether or not your transport is cheap enough. So, motorized infantry. Most of the infantry have transport, which can be armored. There are a lot of SMGs, and I typically see this on regulars or veterans because SMGs on inexperienced troops, they're just throwing points into something that's not very good. So players will typically not do that. They are very maneuverable and really can do concentration of force, like we see with the tank lists. But they are typically weak to pins because transport will be open-topped or soft-skinned, both. So you'll get pinned by enemy small arms fire. There are sort of two versions of this list. One where you have this as a pseudo tank list with Bren carriers or White Scout cars or Hanomaks. The White Scout cars and the Hanomaks are maybe too expensive to run this as a real motorized infantry list, but the Bren carrier is just perfect. And you can have 5-man units in those Bren carriers, and they can get out and have SMGs and shoot 10 shots each from each unit. That is perfect. That is a motorized infantry list. But you can also see this done with trucks, basically. So and we have the forward deployment list. Forward deployment lists are not very common, but they do crop up sometimes. And it's not a build that I've seen much of, but I am expecting to see more of it because I think this could be very competitive. So it's typically something that you'll see with Soviets. Soviets have good infantry, the Soviet scouts, which can forward deploy. And this means that you can be on the center line very early on. So they're really good at board control. Typically, you'll see 3 or more units that are forward deploying, and they'll typically be good infantry units. You can also see this, so that I mentioned the Soviet Scout, but you can also, I used to run native irregulars. I did exactly the same. That was a forward deployment army. And you can see this with Americans as well, with the Rangers lead the way, where you move into the center of the table. You can see it with Chinese, where you have the Sparrow tactics, where you forward deploy as well. So there are a few nations which does this well, but it's not something that I see often yet. I expect to see it more. It can be very, very aggressive because you're starting so much closer to the enemy. So you're going to hit the enemy in close combat or in SMG range in turn 2. And that can really mean that you have the board control. So in some missions, it can be really strong. But there are missions that disallow forward deployment. So you can end up in missions where your forward deployers are ineffective. And that really sucks when you base your whole tactics around that forward deployment, right? So yeah, that's the forward deployment army. Then we have the Reki army, which is an army build that is coming up more and more. It's really difficult to get outside of theater selectors, but you can find it if you allow all units that are allowed in generic reinforced platoons and not just armies of. It has 3 or more units that have Reki. It will sometimes have Reki on the infantry as well, although do not confuse it with cavalry lists. They are a different type of build. It's really fun to play. I'm not sure. I'm on the fence about whether it's worth it or not. We have seen a Reki list do very, very well at the latest Danish nationals. I ended up facing that in the finals, and I won ish. It was a draw, but I had 1 point more than my opponent, so I ended up winning the Danish nationals. But my opponent, Anas, had built a list around the American Scouts. I'm not sure whether it was the list, whether it was Anas, or whether it was the novelty of having Reki on infantry that made him do so well. So I'm on the fence about whether or not these Reki lists are worth it. But they're really fun. They're so fun to play. And I think we're going to need to see more of them before we can really evaluate this army build, whether or not it's good or bad. I'm being joined by an insect. Right. In theater selectors, of course, you can have armies. I think there's a German selector where the Hanomaks have Reki. And then there is, of course, the British selector where it's all basically Reki trucks and Reki jeeps for the special air service in the desert, the long range desert group. That has Reki on everything as well. So very fun to play, worth it. I'll get back to you on that. Then we have the assault lists. This is also one of the list army builds that I know quite well. I've played this quite a lot. Most infantry in an assault list is geared towards melee. And you typically need special rules to assist with that. So fanatics is good, tough fighters necessary. The British special rules that are geared towards like the national rules, so Up and Adam, tough as old boots, that war cry thing where you can't get shot in defensive fire. All of those are good. Of course, we have for the Brits the Maoris and the Gurkhas that are really good. So you need some sort of special rules assistance in order to make an assault list effective. You also see typically assault lists done with veterans or with inexperienced Horde type infantry. It's very, very aggressive. Although again, the best players who does this are not overly aggressive. They are sort of building up their aggression, because if you just run towards the enemy, you're going to get shot to pieces. And it is a list that takes the initiative, that wants to do something and therefore tries to do that thing. And if you let an assault list do their thing, you're going to get murdered. You're going to lose. But with assault lists, it is quite easy to lose kill points, especially if you're combining this with like transports. If you want your infantry to be transported forward to where they're going to assault, those transports, they quite often die. And when you do the melee, when you charge in, you're going to lose men. You're going to lose men to defensive fire, you're going to lose men in the close combat, and you're going to lose men after the close combat when the enemy respawns. So it is easy to lose kill points with assault army builds. Then we have the cavalry lists, and I've made a whole video about cavalry, so you go and watch that if you want to know more about this. There are different types of cavalry lists that you can see built, but in general, all or most of the infantry is mounted so that it becomes cavalry. It's very maneuverable, very survivable. It's fairly tough in melee, or it is even the best assaulters in the game if we're talking about Polish lancers. It can be difficult to support, especially like some armies that can do cavalry well can sometimes struggle to support them well. So the Polish, for instance, it's easy to choose your infantry choices because you're just running Polish lancers, but it's really difficult to figure out what it is you want to join those. What do you need? How do you cover AT, for instance? How do you get that into your army lists? So the actual building of the army list can sometimes be a bit difficult. And cavalry lists are quite often also quite limited in their shooting capacity, so they will quite often be outgunned by their opponents. Then we have the MSU lists, multiple small units. I've made a video about these as well, along with David Hasselfeld, one of the Danish VTC players. And multiple small units, it focuses on one mechanic of the game and maxes out on that mechanic. The mechanic is that order dice is what determines whether or not you have the initiative of a game, right? So you're pulling that order dice out of the bag. And with MSU lists, army builds, you're maximizing the amount of order dice you have in the bag so that you can get to decide what you want to do most of the time. You get the first order dice most of the time. You get the last order dice most of the time. And typically that is what you want. You want the first one at some point of the game. You want the last one at some other point of the game. And with MSU lists, army builds, you're getting that most times. They will have a very high order dice count, so 21 order dice plus, which is why you also see this can quite often have some overlap with the Horde army, although with multiple small units, there's a specific build difference because you're minimizing your units, as with the Horde army, you're often maximizing the size of the units, although minimizing the cost, of course. It takes initiative because it skewers the odds in the order dice in your favor. And it can deliver quite often a lot of pins because you have so many units that can shoot all of them. So you're delivering a lot of pins. But since your units are small, they become vulnerable. And that means that in kill point missions, you can be horribly vulnerable if you don't have like an extra plan for how to protect your many order dice. So that's the MSU build. And then we have the barbecue build. The barbecue list or the flamer spam list typically has 3 to 5 flamethrowers in the list, although I have seen one list which had 7 flamethrowers in it. That was insane. They are typically mounted on regular engineers or on vehicles. Regular flamethrower teams are also quite often used, and that is because regular engineers is the cheapest way of getting a flamethrower in your army, where the flamethrower, if that gets killed by a sniper or sixes, rolling sixes, what's it called? Special damage, right? If that gets killed, that flamethrower, the unit still lives, right? Whereas if it's a team, it immediately dies. So engineers and vehicles, and one of the vehicles that you quite often see used for this is the BA-20, which can have a flamethrower turret. So an armored car which has Reki 7+, and a flamer. Perfect. The good thing about this is that the flamethrowers can kill anything. There's nothing in bold action that is, I don't care about fire. Everything does. The Death Star tanks can be killed by flamethrowers. Everything can get killed. But the detriment is your range is pretty limited. So that can mean that your list, typically what you'll see with people who play the barbecue list, is that they are a counterpunch army. When the enemy has pushed up somewhere, the barbecue list will pounce on them and kill them. So typically the barbecue list will wait for the enemy to make a mistake before they engage, and that is reactive, of course, which can be a problem. That was it for me. So again, this was not something where I'm trying to like limit what it is that you can and should do in bold action. This is just what I see, the types of builds that I see being used. And quite often you'll see one thing that I haven't mentioned in the actual PowerPoint is I'll quite often see these builds being combined. So you'll quite often see a combination of maybe MSU and Gunline, or MSU and Death Star. So like combinations of two of these builds will be used a lot. And I think that is the way to go as well. Although you also see like pure armies that run in one direction. But for me, combining two elements is quite often stronger than just having one element of it, because you have two things that you can do. So one element can sort of make up for the deficiencies of the other element, the other army build. Of course, you need the points for that, but hey, it is what our game is all about, right? The balance of points for value. Right. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you will use these terms to talk about what it is that you see. And if I missed any, please write it in the comments. I would love to see and hear if there are new things that I haven't considered, that I haven't seen yet. Bring it to the table and let's talk about it. Cheers.